As we start the new year, 2010, the establishment politicians, economists, and Wall Street are trying to convince themselves that we have turned the corner and economic growth has once again begun. The predictions that conditions are getting back to normal come from those who never saw the crisis coming and don't have the vaguest notion what caused it. Some of them concede that it could be a jobless recovery. That will establish a new definition for a recovery. Official unemployment is at 10%, but even the government knows that if everyone is counted, including those individuals that are too discouraged to even be looking for work, the unemployment rate is 17%. Free market economists claim the actual unemployment rate is closer to 22%. There's reason to believe that the correction has just barely started and has a long way to run. If the financial bubble came from excess credit created by the Federal Reserve, doubling the money supply can hardly be a solution. It wouldn't make much sense for a doctor taking care of a very sick patient from severe infection to deliberately give the patient another infection. Yet that's what the PhD doctors are doing to our very sick economy. It can't work. It will make the economy much sicker. If our leaders don't wake up soon, the economy will be brought to its knees. Great danger lies ahead. In foreign policy, it's always crucial that the motives of those who would do us harm are understood. Denial of the truth and accepting more politically palatable excuses will guarantee that threats to our safety will continue as we pursue a seriously flawed involvement overseas. It's the same in economic policy. If there's denial or ignorance of the real cause of financial bubbles and the inevitable corrections that must follow, the economy cannot be re-energized. We should have learned the lesson from the Depression of the 1930s that it was a predictable result from the Federal Reserve's orchestrated excesses of the 1920s. Instead, the newborn Keynesian economists who took charge made certain that the correction would not be a 1 or 2 year affair as were the previous corrections in our history. The aggressive intervention by Hoover and Roosevelt, the Republicans and the Democrats, turned a short recession into a Great Depression, which lasted until the end of World War II. The real tragedy was that the interpretation of the 1930s institutionalized bad economic theories. Unfortunately and erroneously, the Depression was blamed on the gold standard, free markets, and a lack of regulations. Though monetary policy was analyzed, its importance was 100% misinterpreted. The low interest rates and excess credit of the 1920s, driven by the Federal Reserve policy, was not considered a factor in producing the stock market bubble and the malinvestment. Instead, the 1930s analysts and even later analysis by Milton Friedman and the monetarists, along with academic scholars like Bernanke, came to an opposite conclusion. The Fed was at fault, but only because it was too tight, arguing that massive monetary inflation was the only answer to the slumping economy. And now we are witnessing a grand experiment by the very person who for years claimed special knowledge regarding the Depression. Chairman Bernanke is in the midst of trying to solve the problem of massive monetary inflation and excessively low interest rates instituted by his predecessor, Alan Greenspan, by implementing even more inflation at historic rates. The sad part is the answer to his very risky experiment with the wealth of our country and the health of our economy will take years to analyze. The conclusions will be just as flawed as they were in the aftermath of the Great Depression by an intellectual and political community that had totally rejected commodity money and the principle of free markets with the current understanding in Washington. One hope, though, is that free market thinking and Austrian economic theories will have greater influence in the next decade or two, since their influence is now on a dramatic upswing. But there are a lot of hurdles to overcome. In the 1930s, in an effort to find the true cause of the crisis, Congress ordered an official investigation. It became known as the Pecora investigation, named after Ferdinand Pecora, the aggressive chief counsel of the hearings. It received a lot of public attention and brought about many major changes, but tragically, every conclusion made and new policies implemented caused the Depression to worsen and legitimized bad economic theories that continue to haunt us to this day. The Federal Reserve was not blamed except for not printing enough money fast enough. Artificially low interest rates and malinvestment, the main source of the grossly distorted economy and the bubble of the 1920s, were exonerated. Not enough regulations were blamed. Thus, the Glass-Steagall Act and the Securities Act of 1933 were passed and deepened the recession. Separating commercial and investment banking and the newly created SEC were to have solved all future problems, as long as the Fed was free from any restraint in its money creation. Operations which were set there to serve big government spenders and members of the banking cartel. Since the flaws in the monetary and economic system were not corrected but made worse after the Depression, it was to be expected that periodic booms and busts would persist. The longer these cycles could be peppered over with new money and credit, the greater would be the distortions and debt that would one day have to undergo a major correction.